We've been hearing a lot in the previous panel, Moshe, about what the trends in public opinion are and how that is changing the ground rules for the conflict. So it seems only fitting that this final panel will deal with the issue of public opinion, and we have two of the really most important experts on this subject from Israel and Palestine here. You have the biographies in your biographical material, but I think it is only fair to say that Khalil Shikaki seems to spend as much time explaining Palestinian public opinion to Americans in Washington as he does in taking polls. But it's delightful to have him back here again. And Jacob Shamir is not only a senior lecturer at Hebrew University and Mr. Public Opinion in many respects in Israel, but he is also taught all around the United States as well as at Tel Aviv University and Bar Ilan. Both of them are graduates of American institutions, so whatever they say that was interesting and good, we'll give credit to American education, and any mistakes they have will reflect where they currently live. To start out, Dr. Shamir is going to kick it off, and he's going to stand up here so he can use the remote and change the slides. So you need to look at this at the screen while you're listening to him. And it's a great privilege to have both of these gentlemen with us this morning to wind up the morning part of the program. Jacob?
Thank you, Sam, and I'd like to begin with just a few background sentences on the joint Israeli-Palestinian public opinion research project. The project is a joint initiative of the Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace at the Hebrew University and the Palestinian Center for Policy and Civil Research in Ramallah, headed by Khalil. And I also, of course, want to thank USIP for giving me the opportunity to continue to work on this project while I'm here. The project is unique in several respects. First, it is the only joint Israeli-Palestinian project which tracks both public's opinion simultaneously since the beginning of the Intifada. Secondly, it is one of the few joint projects which survived the violent turnabout in the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. And finally, in making our findings public, we hope to make a modest contribution in turning people's private opinions into more accurate and knowledgeable public opinion. Up to now, we have conducted altogether 11 joint polls since July 2000, and the most recent survey was completed about 3 weeks ago, and we'll share with you today some of its extremely important findings. Recently, we witnessed a significant change in the rules of the game played between Israel and the Palestinians. And to borrow Putnam's metaphor, this game is a two-level game played between leaders on the international table and leaders and their publics and the other political actors on the domestic table. And we can even envision it as a three-level game, and the role of the United States playing on the third table has been discussed already before. When domestic games are concerned, public opinion very often constitutes a significant constraint on policy and policymakers. But public opinion can open new opportunities for the leaders, and this is actually where we stand right now. And the way Sharon and Abbas will play their domestic games will determine to a large extent whether indeed we're heading towards a breakthrough or whether we are observing just another passing mirage. So let me begin with the Israeli domestic game. Clearly, Arafat's departure from the scene has largely driven the change in the political climate. But there is also much significance to what evolved on the Israeli scene. And here we can trace the change 1 year earlier to the beginning of public opinion pressure on Sharon to break the stalemate. And among these, most important are the Geneva Initiative from October 2003 and the dissidents refusing to serve in the territories. And luckily, Dov Weissglass, Sharon's senior advisor, would concur with me, I think, on this point. In his revealing interview in the leading Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, he explained what motivated the disengagement plan. And I quote, he says, the economy was stagnant, and the Geneva Initiative garnered broad support. And then we were hit with letters of officers and letters of pilots and letters of commandos, and of course he meant letters of refusals to serve in the territories. And he goes on saying, these were not weird kids with green ponytails and the ring in their nose who give off strong odors of grass. These were really our finest young people. So in this interview, Weissglass also revealed Sharon's hope that his initiative will put the quartet's roadmap deep into deep freeze. In any case, it is no coincidence that Sharon's disengagement was announced in December 2003, 2 months after the Geneva Initiative. And Sharon's declaration, in turn, produced a chain reaction in the Israeli public, which I want to share with you now. And this is where Steve here, this is what I meant by my comment to you personally before. Since the beginning of the Intifada, we are tracing Israelis' willingness to dismantle most of the settlements in the territories as part of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. But in addition to people's attitudes on this issue, we also trace the general norm. We do this by asking people not only what they think about the issue, but also what they think the majority of the public thinks. People's perception of the majority opinion gives us the prevailing norm about an issue. We call this the normative facet of public opinion, the climate of opinion. And in the next slide, I want to show you both graphs together, what people actually think on the issue of the settlements and what they think the majority thinks. In other words, what the normative opinion is. The green line marks the actual level of support for dismantling most of the settlements for peace. The red line marks the climate of opinion, the percent of people who believe that the majority of the public supports it. Now, this tells us a fascinating story. Since the end of 2001 already, over 50% of the Israelis support the dismantling of most settlements for peace. This, however, is still not perceived as a normative step. All that time, only a minority of the public believed that this is the majority opinion. When does this position become normative? Immediately after Sharon's public declaration of his disengagement plan. And you can see the big jump in the red line from 37% to 56% to 63% in the following months. In other words, Sharon's Herzliya speech in December 2003 legitimized the dismantling of settlements in the eyes of the Israeli public. Now, what can we learn from this case? First, that like in the first Intifada, the Israeli public was ahead of its leaders on a crucial policy issue and provided an opportunity for Sharon's dramatic policy turnabout. Secondly, contrary to common beliefs, wide support for a policy option is perhaps necessary for its implementation, but it is not always sufficient since it does not always entail legitimacy, normative legitimacy. And this is where leaders' role and how they play the game with their publics becomes so important. Now, another case where public opinion provides an opportunity for its leaders, and this time on both sides, comes from our joint research on some of the core issues which underlie the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In June 2003, we asked both Israelis and Palestinians whether they would support a mutual recognition of Israel as the state of the Jewish people and of Palestine as the state of the Palestinian people in the context of a comprehensive settlement. Now, this is an extremely touchy issue for Israelis who suspect that Palestinians conspire to change the Jewish identity of the state in their demand for the right of return. In addition, we asked respondents what is the majority opinion on the issue within their own public and in the other side's public. So let's have a look at the responses that we obtained. We can see that there was at the time majority support in both publics for such a step. 52% among Palestinians and 65% among Israelis supported it. Now, in our most recent survey, the level of support further increased to become 63% among Palestinians and 70% among Israelis, but you cannot see this in the table. What is also evident from the table is that at the time, each side misperceived the level of support of the other side. Only 37% of the Palestinians and only 32% of the Israelis believed that there is majority support for this step in the other side. In addition, while 59% of the Israelis knew of the Israeli majority support, only a minority of the Palestinians, 40%, believed that there is majority support for such a step among Palestinians. Again, this tells us two important things, in fact. First, while an issue can enjoy majority support, it may still not be seen as normative and legitimate. Secondly, these results open another important opportunity for Sharon and Abbas to bring both publics closer on this important identity issue by making their publics aware of the other side's position and by legitimizing it among their own constituency. Now, in this respect, you will hear today from Khalil some very exciting and optimistic results from our most recent poll. Both publics have made significant progress towards compromise on the major components of Clinton's permanent settlement framework, which, of course, presents another opportunity for Sharon and Abbas. But you should keep in mind that these trends can become political reality only if they are transformed from a bunch of private opinions picked up by polls into legitimate and normative public opinion widely shared and acknowledged publicly. And here, I want to concur with strongly with what Steve and Bob said on the involving public opinion on both sides, and if you don't see it done by the elites and the leaderships, you should become much more skeptical about the chances of the process. Now, legitimacy is a two-way road, and leaders must obtain legitimacy from their publics too. And this is crucial for the standing in the international table of the two-level game. While success in an election race is usually necessary to secure legitimacy, it is not always sufficient, and Abbas's standing as the genuine successor of Arafat's legacy is not yet secured, I believe. A major challenge to his legitimacy and leadership is posed by the young guard of the Fatah movement, still by Arafat loyalists in the government, and of course, by the Islamists and particularly the Hamas. So despite his success in the election, and hopefully in reaching a ceasefire, Abbas' ability, at least in the short run, to make bold political moves on the international table cannot be taken for granted. Sharon's legitimacy is also challenged by the settlers who pushed for a referendum in order to disrupt the disengagement, and by the Likud rebels who try to portray his newly formed government as being at the mercy of the Israeli left and the Arab parties in Israel. Elections in Israel before the completion of the disengagement plan is still not that far-fetched, although Shas may enter the government soon, and we should wait and see, and they cannot be always trusted. The ceasefire, which could be reached very soon, can open the way to turn this disengagement plan into a coordinated, I'm not saying negotiated, but perhaps a coordinated step rather than a unilateral step. But on the other hand, it makes the disengagement plan hostage to the Islamist militants. Now, the threat to use violence against Israel has become the most important leverage of the Islamists in the internal Palestinian power struggle. It is a means to obtain political concessions and get a share in the newly forming Palestinian leadership. In the international game, Hamas is trying very hard to depict the disengagement plan as an Israeli defeat and a Palestinian victory. The battle over who won has long-range implications for the temptation on the part of the Palestinian militants to force Israel to negotiate a permanent settlement under fire. In this context, we asked both Palestinians and Israelis if they see the disengagement plan as a Palestinian victory, and more generally, who came out the winner since the beginning of the Intifada. As you can see, 3/4 of the Palestinian public do see the disengagement plan as a Palestinian victory, and this is not necessarily consistent, Bob, with what you said about Israelis' perceptions of winning, or Israelis' feeling of winning, since 42% of the Israelis feel the same, and this is not a negligible percent. However, when we ask both publics to assess the overall results of the Intifada, and we give them a large range of choices, the picture changes significantly. On the question who came out the winner since the beginning of the Intifada, the most popular answer in both publics was neither one. 55% of the Israelis and 44% of the Palestinians chose this answer. Palestinians then seem to have mixed feelings about the results of the Intifada, and the big question is, will Abbas be able to effectively mobilize the Palestinian public to pressure the Islamist factions to accept and maintain a ceasefire? Now, some, of course, real achievements in improving Palestinians' daily life in the territories can help in this respect. And we are now also talking about Israel leaving other major cities in the territories. But I think that the threat to use violence against Israel will remain the most important leverage of the Islamists in the domestic Palestinian game. So let's have a look at Israelis and Palestinians' expectations in this respect. And expectations are seen to embody the aggregate wisdom of public opinion, its ability to learn from the past and from the current situation. In our surveys, we regularly ask both publics to tell us what will happen next. And when we combine the two answers, which refer to negotiations with or without violence, we get a fascinating chart. The last point in the graph refers to our December poll and shows that high percentages in both publics expect negotiations to resume, either with no violence or with some violence continuing. Now, consistent with these expectations, 47% of the Israelis are even willing to negotiate with the Hamas to reach a compromise settlement with the Palestinians. And again, this is not negligible if we all remember how difficult it was to move the Israeli public to negotiate with the PLO in history. Now, this slide is remarkable because it shows that both public's expectations are very sensitive to political developments and they read political reality correctly. What is particularly striking is the fact that both public's expectations over time are virtually identical, even though they are exposed to different media and have been obtained independently. But expectations are not all rosy, and in the next chart, we combine the two answers which refer to the use of violence irrespective of negotiations. And as you can see, here, both public's expectations that some violence will continue are very high and much less sensitive to events and developments. And this means that both publics take the continuation of some violence, at least, more or less as given. This is particularly true for the Israeli public, whose expectations in this respect remain virtually flat and did not change since the beginning of the Intifada. For the Palestinian public, we see some decline in expectations for violence after Arafat's death, but 2/3 of the Palestinian public still expect some violence to continue. Now, to sum up, public opinion in both sides opens a window of opportunity for the leaders. This may greatly facilitate the game on the international table. Other internal factors, however, pose legitimacy threats and threat to spoil the game unless they make political gains. The use of violence against Israel has turned from largely a means of resistance to the occupation into a political resource in the Palestinian internal or domestic game. Both publics are aware of it and judge that it will not go away soon and will remain part of the political reality for the time being. The main difference, however, between Arafat and Abbas is that Abbas seems to understand the shortcomings of violence in the international game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I neglected to ask you all at the beginning, as I was carefully instructed to do, to turn off your cell phones and pagers. I guess that was done anyway. None have gone off. And to stay in your places until the end of the session, because we do have some cameras here. If you get up in the middle, you're likely to obscure the view. Incidentally, in case you were curious, this session is intended really to provide the background for the session we had first. Khalil?
Thank you very much. What I will be talking about is the prevailing attitude in the post-Arafat period. And as you can see, I will say that there is more optimism, there is a shift in the balance favoring the nationalists, support for the peace process is increasing, the role of violence is still where it was, and the vote for Abbas has reflected public support for the peace process. What I should have added, given the fact that today we have local elections in Gaza, 10 locations in Gaza will have local elections today, and the results of these elections are going to come as a shock to most of you. And I should therefore have added that, but I'll try to say a few things about the local election. And I must say from the outset, therefore, that one should distinguish between local elections and national elections. People's behavior is different in each one, and the motivating factors for each, as I will say, are different. Let me start by saying what was happening in December. Arafat died in November and December. Arafat died, and that quickly generated a lot of sympathies for the nationalists. This is the father of the nation, and it reminded everybody that's the nationalist movement that have led the Palestinians all along these years, and the Islamists are only newcomers, so this did help a lot. The nationalists gained the limelight and gained sympathies and support. The nationalists actually did better than expected. Very quickly they were able to manage a succession process that was admired by everybody. A lot of people who doubted Fatah's ability, including my son, to actually do this, were asking themselves, should I join this movement? My son told me he's thinking about joining Fatah because of what happened. I was amazed. He's a person who isn't usually thinking along these lines, but I think it affected a lot of people's attitudes regarding what Fatah can or cannot do. This was a very good point for Fatah. And it, of course, very quickly decided to go into elections, into presidential elections, and that generated a lot of expectations, and Hamas decided to boycott. And as a result of Hamas's decision to boycott, it was very clear, therefore, that only the nationalists will win. And a lot of people wanted to join the bandwagon and be with the winners. So all of these conditions, what I am about to tell you, and should be taken in light of that. A lot of these dynamics that occurred will gradually diminish. The support for Fatah, or the sympathies for Fatah, will gradually diminish because Arafat's death will gradually be forgotten. There are other things that were happening, and for example, there was a reduction in the level of violence. And certainly if this continues in a positive direction, that we will see more reduction in the violence, this will have a positive effect. But if things change, this will have a negative effect. There were things that did not change, domestic things that did not change, and this is important for local elections. Local elections are based, voter behavior in local elections is based on how they perceive the local environment. And the local conditions did not change. Corruption, mismanagement, lack of strong institutions, etc., is something that Palestinians have been perceiving for the last decade. And nothing changed there. And therefore, that's a hint of what will be the outcome of today's elections in Gaza. Hamas will certainly do very, very well. I will not be surprised if Hamas won all the seats in the elections in Gaza today. But this should not be taken to mean that this is the basis for people's decisions with regard to national matters, such as the vote for Abbas or the vote for the parliamentary elections. It will certainly have an impact, but this is not going to be the most important factor. There are other things from the Israelis that did not change. The closure regime remained in place, settlements built up, the wall, and so all of these things, which usually have a direct impact on the level of support for violence, did not change. So let's see what happened. Let's see where the optimism is. Some of this optimism come from the belief that Arafat's that is going to bring more improvement in the peace process. This is only natural. Most people believe that Arafat was tough at the negotiating table, and that with him gone, with him out of the picture, there is a better chance to reach agreements. But the surprising part are the three other columns, where actually for the first time we see people believe that one can reach an agreement with the current Israeli government. When Sharon was first elected, less than 10% of the Palestinians believed that Sharon's intentions are peaceful. And here we have more than 50% of the Palestinians believing it's possible to reach an agreement with him, and that it's possible for him to convince the Israeli public to buy this compromise agreement. And even more surprising is the extent to which people believe that Abbas and Abu Ala, the new leaders on the Palestinian side, are able to reach an agreement and are able to convince the Palestinian public to support this agreement. We can also see optimism in terms of the expectation of what will happen now. This is something that Yaakov has already mentioned. We can also see it in the expectations of how soon reconciliation would be achieved. When we compare this with the situation just before, as you can see clearly, there has been a dramatic increase in the level of belief that reconciliation is achievable. We can also see it in the expectations with regard to the roadmap. A lot more people now believe that it is possible to implement the roadmap compared to where we were before. This is the second change that we have seen in the post-Arafat period. It's the balance of power between the Islamists and the nationalists. I would warn again that this should not be taken to mean that the results of the elections in the local government today in Gaza will lead to a victory for Fatah, although there is indeed, as you can see, between September and December, there has been a very significant increase in the level of support for Fatah and a significant drop in the level of support for Hamas. On the one hand, as I said, this reflected the sympathies that were generated after Arafat's death for Fatah and the way Fatah has managed to deal with the succession process, go into elections, the fact that the Islamists boycotted the elections. And all of these are temporary, and therefore a lot depends on how things evolve from now on. But it certainly is a significant change. This is particularly important with regard to the Gaza Strip, that I wanted to show the chart on the one just before. All right, this is the one in the Gaza Strip, which actually shows even a more dramatic shift in the balance of power favoring the nationalists in the Gaza Strip. Once again, I would just warn that one should not make conclusions with regard to local elections based on this. This will certainly have a lot of impact on the outcome of the parliamentary elections, which are scheduled to take place in July of this year. But it will have no impact, I must warn, will have no impact on the local elections. Local elections will be voted on matters of corruption, mismanagement, and all of that. And there the public is completely disillusioned and disappointed with the nationalists and will not bring in the nationalists to lead their local councils. There has been this is another change that we have seen, a greater level of support for the peace process, support for mutual cessation of violence, support for reconciliation, support for immediate return to negotiations, and even support for the roadmap indicate the level of support indicate that the December period, the post-Arafat period, is certainly one in which there is more optimism and accompanied by greater support for the peace process. This is the, we're not able to see the whole thing. This is this is what Yaakov was talking about. The level of support. This is just Palestinians. The level of support for the Clinton parameters, for the Geneva compromises, for the top of compromises. Essentially, we have broken down these compromises into six elements, and the last column there, the last two columns are about the identity question, the recognition of identity, Israel as a state for the Jewish people, Palestine, the state for the Palestinian people. And as you can see, among Palestinians, there has been significant changes with regard to most of these elements. With regard to Jerusalem, there hasn't been any change. In fact, if any, it has declined a little bit. And with regard to the demilitarized state, again, there has been a decline in the level of support. But with regard to the question of refugees, with regard to borders, with regard to security, with regard to the mutual recognition of identity, there has been significant increase in the level of support among Palestinians. An increase that, in fact, could only be explained by Arafat's death and the belief that there will be, and the optimism that was generated by that. We have found in the past that the more optimistic people are, the more likely they will support compromises. And the increase in the level of optimism was reflected immediately in the level of willingness of Palestinians to accept compromises. Now, the next chart shows the changes with regard to Palestinians and Israelis, which, in fact, we were expecting to see changes on the Palestinian side. But what was indeed very surprising to us is the level of change on the Israeli side as well. The optimism that was generated among the Israelis was also reflected in the way the Israelis attitudes change with regard to these same compromises. What we are comparing here are the results of the surveys that were conducted among Palestinians and Israelis in December of 2003 and December 2004 and the early days of December 2005. The overall picture when it comes to the package, the total package, as you can see, the Israeli support increased from 47% to 64%, and among Palestinians from 39% to 54%. For the first time in 10 years of public opinion polling that I have done among Palestinians, this is the first time that I see a majority in support of ideas along the lines of the Clinton parameters. And this is something that, in fact, has been evolving over time. The last 10 years have seen a gradual increase in the level of support or willingness of the Palestinians to support compromise. On the Israeli side, the Israelis have been, in some of these compromises, more willing than Palestinians to accept them. There are still problems with regard to Jerusalem and refugees, but as you can see, the trend is the trend with regard to refugees is an increased level of support, and when it comes to Jerusalem, both sides are on the border case, on the border of a majority, not a majority, and a lot, of course, depends on where leaders take them and on the packaging of the compromises that are involved. Now, let me take you to the fourth change that I've talked about. This is the non-change. This is the attitude with regard to violence. Little has changed with regard to the role of violence in the thinking of Palestinians. So despite all the dramatic changes that I've just described, optimism, support for the peace process, change in the balance of power, the reduction in the level of support for Hamas, this has not affected the level of support for violence and the way Palestinians perceive the role of violence. This is on the question of the support for violence against Israeli civilians. Nothing has changed. Who came out a winner? This is, again, just among Palestinians. As you can see, there is a slight change with regard to the belief that Palestinians came out winners, but it's not a dramatic change like the other changes. And in fact, when we asked the question about the disengagement being a victory for armed struggle throughout the period of last year, starting in May, September, and going to December. Public perception has been that his victory has been on the rise, rather than it certainly is not in parallel with the changes that we have seen earlier. With regard to the belief that armed confrontations have helped Palestinians achieve national rights, as you can see, a majority of Palestinians believed so throughout the period of the Intifada. And in fact, this is something that started just before the Intifada, immediately after the collapse of the Camp David. You can see clearly a majority of Palestinians believe that if Palestinians do resort to violence, that this will help them achieve national rights, and this has continued the belief in that. A majority continued to believe in that since then, and December did nothing to change that perception. Now, let me take you to the last point I want to make here, and that is about the outcome of the election. These are the people who have voted for Mahmoud Abbas. The most important thing here is that essentially all of Fatah voted for Abbas, and that is very important, because that meant that people that Fatah, that this was a vote for Fatah rather than a vote for Mahmoud Abbas as a person. And that certainly is important for Abbas to know, because he has not been, well, surveys have indicated all along during the last 10 years that he is not very popular as a person. And it's very clear here that Fatah has voted for him. Who else voted for him? Well, people who are in the payroll of the PA. Most of them. Students, for example, many of them voted for Mustafa Barghouti. Although I must say that the choices here are not dramatic. This is not a real, genuine choice between Abbas and Barghouti. A genuine choice would have been, of course, if Hamas was there and if Marwan Barghouti was there. But it certainly is an indicative of something. It's not totally irrelevant, but it certainly is useful. The more religious people actually voted for Abbas, but if we continue, you can see that more of Hamas supporters, in fact, voted for Barghouti. So religiosity and political Islam did not go together in this case. Okay. Most important. These are the priorities of Palestinians. And what we're comparing here, priorities for all the voters versus priorities for those who voted for Abbas and those who voted for Barghouti. It's very clear that economic conditions are high on the minds of Palestinians. This is indeed the most important question, and in the minds of those who voted for Abbas, this is number one. The peace process came second, and enforcement of law and order. Is it? It's all right.
Accomplishment of reform.
Oh yes, reform. Reform is issues of corruption. Reform. Right?
Oh, corruption
is the third issue. Well, issues of corruption and reform are certainly things that are going to be critical today. But it was not critical in terms of the selection of Abbas. It came third, in fact. And economic progress and movement on the peace process were most important, and that's really what helped. But in any case, it would have been difficult for Mustafa Barghouti, to compete with Abbas on the question of corruption and reform, because Mustafa has not been able to portray himself as a person who would go after corruption and enforce reform. This is the most. When we ask people what were the most important factors in determining their vote, as you can see again, the most important consideration was the economy. It was the peace process. Economy, peace process. These are the considerations for national elections. It is not the question of corruption, although corruption is important, but the most important is issues of the peace process and issues of the economy. Now, one of the things we've been asking about for some time is this the nature of the Palestinian political system. And under Arafat, when we asked the question, do you want the prime minister to have more power, same power, less power than the president, Palestinians were divided. There was a lot of polarization, almost 50-50, almost, although Arafat did manage from time to time to get to 4 or 5 percentage points more in his favor. No longer the case. With Abbas, with Arafat out of the picture, people want Abbas to govern, not the prime minister. People believe that the man they have elected is the one who should be making decisions. And so the fact that they are electing that person, of course, is important. Very clearly, people are giving Abbas the confidence to move, to make the critical decisions. I don't know if we can go, perhaps if we can go back one step. Yes, this shows an interesting picture as well. When we put together the PLO institutions versus the PA institutions, very clearly we get a picture in which people, this is the survey among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, not all Palestinians, I must remind you. What shows is that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza want the PA to be the leader and not the PLO. And so they want either the president or the PLC to make the most important decisions. They don't want the PNC or the PLO Executive Committee to be making those decisions. And as I said, within the PA then, the question becomes, is it the prime minister in the executive branch? Is it the prime minister or is it the president? And to my own personal disappointment, of course, the public wants to go with the president. Okay, what do they want the president to do? Again, as you can see, what they want him to do is to go back to the negotiations, negotiate the disengagement, for example. I want you to think about the chart I showed earlier, the slide which shows people viewing the disengagement as victory. What people are viewing as victory is not necessarily the unilateral dimension of it, because as you can see, in fact, people want Abbas to negotiate the disengagement. It's victory more in terms of that this is an evacuation of settlements, this is an end to the occupation, but this is not, in other words, Palestinians are not perceiving the Gaza disengagement in the same way the South Lebanon withdrawal was perceived, as Hezbollah forcing the Israelis to unilaterally pull out without negotiations. This is not the case with the Palestinians. Palestinians want negotiations. They are not seeing the disengagement as something taking place outside of a negotiating process. And even if the Israelis want it to be that, the Palestinians don't want it to be that. Now, this is the last one. The last 3 columns, as you can see, is where what I've already shown you earlier about the lack of change with regard to the role of violence becomes important. Even those who voted for Abbas are not necessarily voting for him to put an end to the violence of the Intifada. The question of the violence has not yet changed. In the mindset of the Palestinians, violence is still important, and even those who are electing Abbas are not electing him because he is going to lead. In other words, if Marwan Barghouti was running, Marwan would have done very well in these elections. Not necessarily win, because only 46%, only 54% want Abbas, of Abbas's voters, want him to put an end to the militarization of the Intifada, which is to say there is about 46% or so who in fact want the militarization to continue. Those would have voted for Barghouti, Marwan Barghouti, not Mustafa Barghouti. I think this was the last one. Yes. Let me just remind you again that these elections were national elections, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that the picture we are seeing here is a temporary picture. It may change tomorrow. A lot depends on the level of violence. A lot depends on Fatah continuing to be able to be seen as acting in an orderly manner, being democratic, etc. And certainly a lot will depend with regard to the role of violence. A lot will depend on what will happen with the settlements, what will happen with the wall, what will happen with the continued closure. And certainly for the future of Fatah and the nationalists and their ability to win the hearts and minds of the local people at the local level issues. Nothing is going to change unless Fatah is able to deal with this perception of corruption. For Abu Mazen, it becomes very critical. The local elections in Gaza today are going to be an electric shock for him and for Fatah. They have 3 or 4 more months before they go to the rest of the local elections in April. In April, about 150 locations are supposed to have the local elections. And if Fatah by then has not been able to deal with this problem, with the perceived public perception that Fatah is corrupt, inefficient, etc., Hamas will in fact take over most of the municipalities. In the 10 locations today in Gaza, I have absolutely no doubt that Hamas will take control of either all of them or most of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Khalil. We have just very few more minutes. Let's get a few quick questions in. Back in the back, right on the aisle. And would you identify yourself and then...
My name is Steve Rivkin. I'm a Washington lawyer. And forgive me if I have a question that has almost judicial overtones. What would the impact be on opinion in each community were the international community to begin to take credible steps towards addressing the question of compensation for refugees according to the following values? It would be generous, it would be non-judgmental, it would be fairly administered, and it would be individualized. And in particular, I'm concerned as to whether the penchant in Palestinian society towards continued violence might be eroded by the prospect that the world community is taking steps towards this fundamental grievance. Thank you.
It will have, in my view, absolutely no change whatsoever. The question on the question of the refugees, the issue is not the compensation. Don't, for a minute, think that it's a matter of compensation or money. The question is the question of the legitimacy of the Palestinian narrative with regard to refugees. And that is essentially then the question of the right of return. Do the Israelis recognize it or do not? If they recognize it, then compensation and everything else, the door would be opened, and that kind of inducements would have an open door. If, however, the issue of the right of return is still hanging out there with no resolution, then nothing is going to change public perception with regard to the issues that we have been talking about, with the issue with or without compensation.
Now,
Yes.
Can I answer?
Oh,
He
yeah.
asked about both publics. And with regard to the Israelis, I think Israelis are taking it already for granted. So this is already embedded within their level of support for the Palestinian issue that we saw in the table, which is still relatively low. And I don't think it will change much unless Israelis are really convinced, as I said, that this will not ever threaten the Jewish identity of the state.
Rafi?
Rafi Danziger from APAC. My question is addressed to Khalil. Khalil, you pointed to many very encouraging findings in your polls, and as did you, Professor Shamir. The most troubling one, as you yourself pointed out, is that violence still is seen by Palestinians as the best way to promote national objectives. So to use Professor Shamir's term, that means there still is normative legitimacy to violence among the Palestinians. And of course, you're right that developments on the ground are going to have an effect on that. But isn't there something also for Abbas himself to do and the leadership in terms of trying to change the view of Palestinians, not just to say the violence has been counterproductive, but to go beyond that and to to have more of an effect on what the media says, what's said in the mosque, because I think that there's a lot of damages done by all of that. And if that does not change, then I think we are in for very big trouble.
I must tell you, Rafi, Abbas does not as a person, does not have a great deal of authority. The way the public perceives him is that he is the leader of Fatah. He is the chairman of the PLO. But as a person, is not perceived as a very articulate person with a charisma who would be able to change and sway the public attitude. Don't count on it. What will change public attitude with regard to violence, in my view, is going to be diplomacy working as it was in 95, 96, and the frustration, pain, and suffering that is inflicted by the closure regime, by the settlements, by the wall, etc., is removed. If you remove that and then show that something else is working, then I think diplomacy is working, and then I think we will see dramatic changes in that as well, as we have seen it in the past. We've been there, we've seen this exactly the same way it happened, and over time we have seen the fluctuations reflecting those changes. And I don't believe Abbas' leadership, speaking about it, is going to make much difference, to be honest with you.
Obviously, what will effectively be on the ground and all the steps that Khalil mentioned are going to have or will have a major impact. Still, you don't need necessarily a charismatic personality to make very visible and important symbolic steps to show the public that violence will not help. I think Abbas knows that symbolic steps are important because he has already begun to do some things with respect to corruption. For example, in his most recent visit in Gaza, he ordered right away to dismantle a house which was built on a public lot, to show people that the rule of law is should be effective, should be in effect. So, I mean, there are many ways, really, to show Palestinians that violence is not desirable. And I think, as I said, I strongly believe in these symbolic steps and in the normative facet of public opinion, which is very, very important.
Over here in the back.
Paul Sham, the Middle East Institute. Khalil, I'd like to pick up on your answer to the first question about the importance of the acceptance of the Palestinian narrative. Do you think that there would be a strong, what would the Palestinian public's reaction be if there were a de facto separation between the right of return and the reality of return? In other words, if Israel expressed in various ways that there was a recognition of the Palestinian narrative, but in fact comparatively few refugees would be able to return. And I'd be interested in Yaakov's reaction, what you think the Israeli reaction would be as well.
The reaction of the Palestinians as a whole, I think, would be positive. That as long as the right of return is recognized, then I think the limitations on the modalities would be swallowed, and you'll find a majority willing to go with that. And among the refugees themselves, the overwhelming majority will then act based on it. They will accept the compensation and be happy to see it that taking place immediately. And I think that overall this will not find a lot of dissent among the refugees. That there will be, I believe, widespread acceptance and acceptance not only in terms of verbal acceptance, but also in terms of the behavior of the refugees themselves, their willingness to act and be integrated in the Palestinian state. But that certainly depends on what you've started with, that Israel says that it is willing to recognize that right.
I think symbolic recognition is essential to make progress on the refugees element. And I think that a creative approach to it can in the long run, convince Israelis to accept it, as long as they are convinced that this is not another door left open, and the general understanding of Israelis right now is that Palestinians always attempt to leave something open for the next stage, and this was one of the lectures that Israelis supposedly learned from the Oslo process, where all of a sudden, after recognizing Israel, the issue of the right of return came up that strong. So I think there is room to work on it. It will take time. I think eventually Israelis may support such a symbolic recognition, and as I said, it is really necessary to make progress. But they have to be convinced that this is not a door left open for real functional changes.
Way in the back. See, there are advantages of sitting further back.
Hi, Jeremy Pressman from the University of Connecticut. I wanted to ask both of you about not just the recent polling, but sort of as you look back on the last several years, if you can give us a metaphor to work with as to whose opinion it is that is shifting in each society. Do we think about, for instance, when we talk about the balance of forces, that there are certain people who are always committed to Hamas and certain people always committed to Fatah and the nationalists, and there's some swing voters, or is it much more fluid than that, or is there some alternative? And I'd be curious from both of you about the perspective on Israeli society and Palestinian society.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I think there is a major segment in the Israeli public of people who are middle of the way, which each election, again, there is a new party which tries to grab them in the election. And we can, and they shift again with the overall norm. So right after the eruption of the Intifada, for rather a long time, this segment became silent. And we could really track the normativity of these people in terms of how they define their political leaning, because we often ask people to set themselves on a scale from right to left. And all of a sudden, after the eruption of the Intifada, left almost disappeared. But this is obviously, again, a label which is strongly affected by the prevailing norm at the time. So people who are for a prosperous economy, people whom the Intifada really gave a lot of economic problems and ruined their businesses, people who are threatened by the violence, and those who are middle to left come now out again to support these more moderate steps.
Among the if we're talking about Hamas and Fatah, putting aside the more secular leftist forces, if we just focus on Hamas and Fatah, then the demographics, gender, age, education, income is not important. It's sometimes important, sometimes not important. Overall, it's not a determining factor. Even religiosity is not important. What is, however, what is critical in terms of, as a predictor, who will support Hamas or Fatah is political Islam. The more the more you believe in political Islam, that Islam is a political force, that it should guide the steps of the state, the more likely you'll support Hamas. If you believe that religion is more personal, it has a role in society, but it cannot guide the state, then you're likely to support Fatah.
Don? We'll take one more question after this one.
My question is, how do each of you envisage Israel's implementation of recognizing the right of return? What does this really mean? What's the essence? Is it a mere statement by the Israeli government? Yes, we recognize the right of return, but only 20,000 refugees can return. What do Palestinians mean by this, and what do Israelis mean by it?
Well, as I said, you have to be very creative about it. And right now, the approach of the Geneva Initiative, for example, was to mention the relevant UN resolutions, which in fact recognize, and I mean, of course, there is still a debate about this too, but it was accepted by both sides who were parties to the initiative as a major step forward. And I guess that the Palestinian public is very, very aware of the meaning of these resolutions, since the claim of the legitimate rights is very embedded within the political culture of the Palestinians. So this is one approach that can be done, but there are other possibilities, and as I said, there is creativity required there.
Of course, we haven't polled Palestinians, so I'll only speculate. I'll tell you what, the closer you get to a direct recognition, Israel recognizes the right of return, and refugees will have the following options. Those wanting to return to Israel will have to submit an application to an international commission, which will then decide on who would be allowed to go back to Israel. The overriding consideration is going to be that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. A majority of Palestinians recognize that principle and would be willing to live with it. If something along these lines, I think, would work.
One more question. Okay. Journalist time. Only fair.
My name is Saeed Erekat from Al-Quds Daily newspaper, and my question is to Khalil. Khalil, could you talk a little bit about the gap between the perceptions among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza versus Palestinians outside, PA versus PLO, and what will happen to that perception once or if Abu Mazen is unable to deliver, let's say, in 3 months on the issue, especially the issue of prisoners and targeted killing and so on?
I must say we haven't been able to do sufficient research among Palestinians living abroad. For the reasons you're probably aware of, it's just extremely difficult to do it, particularly in places like Syria. So we don't have a lot of clues as to what is critical in the minds of Palestinians living abroad. With regard to the issue of refugees, it is very clear that Palestinians living abroad believe that the PLO is the most important body that should be negotiating and should be making decisions on their behalf, as we see from those in the West Bank and Gaza. With regard to the overall decisions, it's very clear that those in the West Bank and Gaza believe that those who are in the West Bank and Gaza, elected by the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, are the ones who should be making those decisions. The perception of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza of corruption, mismanagement, all of that applies to the PLO even more so than to the PA. And so within the West Bank and Gaza, you're not going to find a lot of admiration for the PLO.
Well, we could go on, I'm sure, a lot longer, but I want to thank these two gentlemen for a really very illuminating series of presentations. May I just remind you that the program ends with an excellent luncheon, and our old friend Martin Indyk is going to give us a keynote address of his own. And the luncheon is right down the hall. Stay on this level, and we'll be getting going very shortly.
Washington Journal today, a look at the Iraqi elections.